Good evening, everyone. I call this in service of the Wauwatosa School Board to order. It is 7:06 p.m. on Monday, December 7th, 2020. Dr. Ertl and Leanne Fraley are in conference room C of the Fisher Administration Building, 12121 West North Avenue, with other board members participating remotely via the video conferencing platform Zoom. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss teaching and learning during the pandemic. As this is a working session of the board, public comment will not be entertained this evening. Ms. Newman, please call the roll.
I will call the roll. Mr. Doman?
Here.
Ms. Fraley?
Here.
Mr. Meyer?
Here.
Ms. Muehlfeld?
Here.
Mr. Phillips?
Here.
Mr. Rolland?
Here.
Dr. Jess Banger?
I'm here. Thank you, Dr. Ertl. So to set the stage a little bit, wanted to bring the board together to kind of hear from the district leadership team in terms of kind of what we are doing in terms of focusing on teaching and learning this year and really do a deep dive. It's been a conversation we've had quite a few times between March and now, but really want to have a dedicated time for this. I asked Ms. Fraley, who has an area of expertise in this area, as a board kind of liaison to work with the team. And they are going to be here to really have kind of a open conversation. So they will kind of get us kicked off and started, and I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Ertl. But I really am kind of looking, this is going to be a conversation driven, more conversation than presentation. So we'll get some information at the outset, but then I hope board members came with questions and are listening and kind of engaging in a dialogue as we go. Dr. Ertl.
Thank you. Tonight we have a number of people from the Teaching and Learning Department that are going to share some information, and obviously, like you said, get into discussion after that point. So I just kind of want to walk through and kind of share where things are at, what we're looking for moving forward, and really try to be responsive to questions from the board and thoughts, concerns, positives, whatever it is. But Mrs. Bowers, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Jamie, can you pull the presentation up for us? Thank you. So our teaching and learning team is here tonight to share some of the foundational work that is guiding our instruction with students this year. We will highlight how we prepared for 2021 and how we're continuing to support teaching and learning as this year unfolds. Tonight to participate in the discussion are several members of the Teaching and Learning Department. I just want to introduce them quickly. Nicole Marble is our Director of Secondary Education. Jessica Ebert is our Director of Elementary Education. Therese Kwiatkowski, Director of Special Education. Nassif Rogers, Director of Equity. And Mike Koralski, Director of Student Services.
Is anyone else hearing that feedback? Or is that just me?
Sean.
No, I was as well, Sean.
It stopped now.
Okay.
Was someone unmuted and scratching around or something? Or
And maybe.
Am I okay to go ahead? Okay. Jamie, next slide, please. Throughout our discussion tonight, we will aim to answer these questions. How have expectations for student learning changed or evolved for 2020-21 school year? How will we ensure students are grade level ready for the next year or the next course level? And how is student learning being assessed and communicated at the classroom level, school level, and district level? At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Secondary Education, Nicole Marble, and Director of Elementary Education, Jessica Ebert, to get us started.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us here tonight. So as Mrs. Bauer stated, we want to share with you what we have done to prepare for strong instruction this year, as well as what steps we have taken to best support hybrid learning. Jamie, could you go to the next slide, please? So this school year, we continue to have high learning expectations for our students and have made adjustments to the way in which we prioritize learning targets to create the most effective and direct route to the desired outcomes. Mrs. Ebert will explain a little bit more about that in just a moment. But before going on, I want to remind the board, as well as any community members and staff joining us this evening, about our vision of a graduate. This vision was developed during the 2018-19 school year and officially launched in the fall of 2019 in an effort to assist us in developing in our students the skills desired of our current workforce so that they can be successful global citizens. This school year has amplified our needs and our efforts to encourage and directly teach such skills as organization, time management, perseverance, self-advocacy, interdependence, problem solving, communication, flexibility, and cultural awareness. While these life skills have always been a part of our teaching and learning practices, they have taken on a greater level of priority this year out of necessity, and we believe it will leave our students better prepared for real life than ever before. Our teachers and principals have shared stories of how astonished they are by the resiliency of our students, their level of compassion and empathy for one another, and a new level of self-advocacy that they have not seen before. These life skills that our students are practicing and developing must not get lost. I will now turn it over to Mrs. Ebert to talk a little bit more about our specific academic priorities.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about priority standards to get started. So in education, standards really serve as the foundation for curriculum instruction. Many times people will see curriculum and instruction as the resource that we're using to teach our students, either that teacher's manual, a textbook, or a program, but really that's just a supportive tool. It's our standards that inform what we want our students to know and be able to do. And there are a lot of standards, and standards hold different weights at different grade levels, which means some standards have a greater priority at a given grade level or course, and therefore we call those priority standards. And prior to COVID, and as part of our ongoing teaching and learning work, we have been reviewing standards and working to understand those priority standards. Which ones hold the most weight at each grade level and within each content area. And there are several ways in which a standard is really considered a priority standard. It typically serves one or all of these domains: endurance, leverage, and/or readiness. If a standard has that endurance, what that means is that it represents learning way beyond that course or grade level. It represents a concept or skill that might be important to life, and therefore it endures. If a standard has leverage, it means that that standard has learning that can be applied both within the content area or in other content areas. It helps leverage multiple content areas. So sometimes we'll see that with a social studies standards and a writing standard, that those two will complement one another. And if a standard has readiness, what that means is that the standard is essential for success in a new unit, a course of study, or a grade level. By engaging in that standard, students can be ready for what comes next. So this school year, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, or DPI, developed a comprehensive resource to support systems with priority standards in the areas of math and literacy. So that's linked here on the slide. And you can see what the essential outcomes are for every grade level in those content areas. Their work was really informed by Achieve the Core, which is a resource we have been using here in Wauwatosa, since priority standard work is not new to us. And many of the priority standards that they have listed on this resource would mirror our priorities here in Wauwatosa. So if you're looking for a comprehensive list of what is a priority this school year and school years prior and after, you could look here to get that information. In a typical school year, priority standards, we can go back. In a typical school year, priority standards shape our planning and instruction, and they continue to serve us this school year as well. When students are live with us for synchronous learning, it is of great importance that we are providing direct instruction around those priority standards. Our coaching teams and content team leaders have helped to clarify and/or identify these priority standards so that we can all be working toward key learning outcomes when our students are live with us. This may be why we are jumping around math units at the elementary level. We are prioritizing standards. Additionally, part of our work in teaching and learning is always supporting students with any unfinished learning. And we often use the phrase in education, just because we taught it doesn't mean they learned it. We are in the business of learning, and so it is our goal to make sure that students have grasped content and have the necessary skills that they need not that we just cover or teach it and hope that they get it. We often individualize learning, meet with students one-on-one or in small groups to be responsive to students' needs. We've had an even greater emphasis or greater responsibility on supporting students' unfinished learning as we launched into the 2021 school year. We spent countless hours this summer preparing for our return to support students with learning that they may have missed or additional support that they may need from spring of 2020 when we were all learning off campus. And we started the school year discussing and providing professional learning for staff during our opening days on ways in which they could support unfinished learning. And the linked document here on this slide is one example from some of our initial professional learning. It highlights key principles that you can kind of foster when addressing unfinished learning. Another example linked on this slide is work our elementary math coaches developed this summer. They are math bridging documents which highlight learning that would have occurred in trimester 3 of spring of 2020 and where this learning can be supported within the context of the current school year. So I've linked here a grade 1 to grade 2 example. It highlights key learning that would have occurred during trimester 3 for grade 1 and where in which students and teachers can be supported within that content in grade 2. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Therese, who will share a little bit more about how we are supporting all of our learners.
Great, thanks, Jess. We know some of our learners that are struggling or have difficulty, and some of our students with disabilities do need additional services and support to access their learning and make progress. IAP teams and building intervention teams have been collaborating and have developed plans for some of our students to receive additional in-person services or virtual services on asynchronous learning days. This is intended to address gaps in learning by providing consistency in services and opportunities for supported practice. During our most recent shift to virtual learning, we had some of our students with disabilities as well as some of our students receiving interventions coming into schools in person to continue to receive their services during our recent virtual. Next slide.
So to our families and community, this is what they see each week in hybrid learning for students engaging both into Phased Into Learning and TOSA Connected. Students learning live synchronously 2 days a week and independently asynchronously 3 days a week. Yet through strategic lesson planning, our instructional goals are to have all of the synchronous and asynchronous learning flow together. Jamie, next slide, please. So similar to our lesson planning for students when they are in person 5 days a week, our goal is always to keep learning ongoing, spiraling and building off of previous learning. This is true in our hybrid model as well. It's not start and then stop, 2 days of learning followed by 3 days of no learning. Pre-pandemic learning was always supported by direct instruction, opportunities for practice, revisiting lessons when necessary, collaboration, and so on. What our students are experiencing during the pandemic is no different. Depending upon the content area and grade level, students obtain their content input on either synchronous or asynchronous days, and sometimes both, and then engage in practice and application on either synchronous or asynchronous days, and in some cases both. While the hybrid structure might imply that learning is only happening 2 days a week, that is not the case. The goal of the two learning modes complement one another and are not planned in isolation. In short, our teachers aim to plan for learning that bridges and flows in and out of synchronous and asynchronous learning as seamlessly as possible. Next slide, please.
And now we just want to talk a little bit about assessment and monitoring for student growth and understanding this school year. And as we have in years past, we continue to monitor student learning to ensure our learners are growing this school year. One way we do this and have done this in the past is through a system our state calls Multi-Leveled Systems of Support, or MLSS. So you'll hear us refer to MLSS a little bit here. Therese.
Sure. So what does MLSS mean? It means school-based teams working together to provide equitable services, practices, and resources to every learner. School-based teams discuss and monitor all students' response to effective universal instruction. It's also used to identify students who are not responding to the universal instruction and require a more intensive intervention. Students participating in interventions are monitored to assess their response to that intervention that they're participating in. In cases where students are not responding, MLSS teams can make a referral for a special education evaluation to determine if the student has a disability and needs special education services or a 504 accommodation plan.
And so our school-based teams, MLSS teams, they meet formally, weekly or bi-weekly, and continuously they meet informally to review how students are doing with their learning and share any concerns or any questions and talk about ways in which to support students. So you can see from the visual on the slide that equity lives at the center of this system. And it's really through that collaboration, that high quality universal instruction, and the use of data that we work to serve all of our students. And we're going to talk a little bit about that data collection that we call progress monitoring to make sure our learners are on target and how we're monitoring that data. Some of the ongoing data that our teachers use include formative assessments, and those formative assessments really do just that. They inform us. They look like observations or checks for understanding. For example, teachers may review a math problem or student writing to see how the student is doing in that specific standard. These quick assessments help us know really what to reteach, what feedback to give students, and how to inform our instruction. As an example, our elementary literacy in grades SK through 5, after every 5 lessons of our Sunday phonics instruction, students engage in a mastery check. And these built-in mastery checks allow our teachers to make sure students are on track. They inform what needs to be retaught, or if a student has some unfinished learning. This is just one example of an ongoing formative assessment built into our teaching and learning practices. It's data, though, like this that can be shared and discussed and reflected on through that MLSS collaboration. And now Nicole's going to share a little bit more about assessment.
Thank you, Jessica. And to add on to that a little bit more, one of the greatest tools that we have as educators to respond to the formative assessments is feedback. And we have heard from teachers that within our hybrid model, they are able to provide more immediate, individualized feedback to students and are able to correct student misconceptions quickly because of the reduced class sizes. When there are 20 to 30 students in a class, this is something that can take a little bit longer to identify. With the smaller class sizes, teachers are able to make quick, meaningful, individualized learning adjustments. Also, teachers can meet one-on-one or in smaller groups for longer periods of time, and they report that they are meeting with students for about the same amount of time in hybrid as they would for 5 days a week. Teachers are also reporting being able to move through their learning scope and sequence at a similar pace as years past. Therefore, while the quantity of time that students are in school is not what we are used to, the quality of time between students and teachers is deep and rich. So in addition to the formative assessments that Jessica spoke about, staff also use summative assessments, or otherwise known as end of unit assessments, to know how students are performing. And these are tasks that are scored and graded to capture evidence of student proficiency in skills and content, which help us see how student learning looks from year to year. We use this data to adjust instruction, inform us of how students are doing, and make decisions on how to support our learners. And these are all district created assessments. We also have statewide assessments that allow us to assess and monitor how our students are doing. We will be administering our JK-12 statewide early literacy screener called PALS, as well as forward testing, which is still planned for grades 3 through 8, and then social studies in grade 10 for the spring of 2021. Our students that follow alternative learning standards based on individual learning plans will also take the DLM, or the Dynamic Learning Maps assessment, and our students that identify as English language learners will take the Access test, which measures English language proficiency over time. At the national level, all of our 11th graders are anticipated to take the ACT as normal, and all of our high school students that are currently enrolled in advanced placement courses will be eligible to participate in national testing. In the past, the outcomes of these assessments have helped to inform us of how to adjust our practices related to teaching and learning, and they will continue to do so this year and in the future. And with that, that is what we have to start the conversation, and we welcome any questions that any of you have.
Thank you all very much.
I'm happy to get things started. So a number of the questions that we've received from parents, and I discussed with you all when we talked earlier in November, are about coverage. The fear that their child is not getting the same amount of content, be it in preparation for an AP exam or just in fourth grade before, how are we making sure they're ready to move on to the next grade? Can you talk a little bit about the difference between coverage versus standards mastery or proficiency?
I can get us started, and I'll let Nicole and Mrs. Bowers kind of chime in here, or anyone else. And I think that's a really great question, and I think it alludes to what I was speaking to in terms of priority standards, and thinking a little bit about how important it is for us to offer deep and rich instruction and ensure that students have mastered those priority standards, and thinking about that all standards have weight and all standards have importance. It's just, where do we prioritize the time that we are live with our learners? And so when students come to us on those 2 days of hybrid learning, whether that be in person or through TOSA Connected, it's really important that we're delivering that strong, direct instruction around that priority work, knowing that on those asynchronous days, we can cover some of those additional aspects and learning through supplemental supports on those asynchronous days. So I think it's important to know that we look at the whole picture of standards, and then think about what it is we deliver in that synchronous time that would really hold that weight of priority, that deep, rich learning that needs to take place. And then how that fosters and feeds into some of those supplemental standards that can be carried out on those asynchronous days. And so that's kind of a view from an elementary lens. I don't know if, Leanne, that helps answer that question, but I don't know, Nicole, if you want to speak a little bit about AP content and things like that.
Yeah, gladly. So in terms of AP content and making sure that students have what they need in order to be as successful as possible on those AP exams, our teachers have been very strategic about how they are using their synchronous class time. So in the past, where you might have given students a number of days in class to work on a project or do some of the reading or catch up on some of the work that has been assigned, that really is the asynchronous work. Or if in class you would have spent 20 minutes watching a video, for example, that's that asynchronous time. And the synchronous time is really about, how do we apply, let's engage in conversation and dialogue. So it's the application of the content. And especially with our AP learners, they are independent, interdependent learners that have those life skills or are really developing those life skills that I talked about with the vision of the graduate, like being problem solvers, being a self-advocate, if they are up against something that they are uncomfortable with or need some additional support on. So that is how some of our AP teachers have made sure that because we have to cover content with the AP classes in order to adhere to what the AP exams and the College Board have in front of our learners at the end. So that is one way in which our AP teachers have addressed that barrier.
So I'll add just a couple of thoughts. So some of the things, when you look back even a couple of years, and we've talked about trying to get change in education. And unfortunately or fortunately, we all went through school and we were all taught a certain way. And in a, it was a certain time. And when people my age went to school, it was incredibly content rich. That's what, a lot of memorization, things like that. We've been trying to move away from a couple areas, from not being so content based. Obviously some of our courses, and there's knowledge and there's content to be learned, but really trying to teach kids how to learn, not what to learn. The teachers are not anymore just the purveyors of knowledge. Many people would argue that in the palm of a hand with a phone is all the content that that people are going to need. And I think the issue is how do we teach kids to discern truth from falsehoods, and a lot of those kind of skills, and looking at a lot more skills as we go through it. So if there's something, if you look at a positive out of the time that we're dealing right now in a pandemic, obviously the use of technology in learning, we've accelerated that opportunity. But I also think we can really get that shift more and get more people to understand. That's a tough one, because like I said, we were all taught, and a lot of us were taught content. And as we try to move more towards skill-based, and I think that's kind of how we try to approach education. And I think this time will help us do that.
I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Please.
Cool. I guess first question is, are we tracking similarly the students who are doing the WVA track, or is that just a separate system, separate way of doing things?
Can you give a little bit more information about what you mean when you say tracking? Do you mean are we tracking their progress?
Yeah, I guess are there the same kinds of tracking and supports that happen just, as it is going on in the traditional as this is model?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for giving that additional context. Mike, you want to chime in on this one a little bit?
Yeah, Mr. Rolland, one of the things that Student Service is doing every week is we're meeting and we're looking around the 3 different modes of instruction: Wauwatosa Virtual Academy, Tosa Connected, and Phased Into Learning. And in Wauwatosa Virtual Academy specifically, because that was the question, Dean Hoyce, as well as his staff, have really been doing a nice job of pulling reports, allowing us to see progress of students, or sometimes lack of progress of students, and looking at what does an intervention look like in a virtual model, and then how do we kind of utilize our resources within student services from their home school about how to better support or engage the students in learning. So we are looking at it. We are seeing, again, that there are some students who do need more help, that they're not making the progress or being as successful as we know that they can be at the rate we want, and looking at specifically what might the issue be. Is it a lack of space? Is it a lack of understanding? Are they having trouble getting connection with their teacher from Pearson? And at least beginning those dialogues to kind of move learners forward and try to get better results out of all of our students.
Thank you. No, that satisfies my question. I guess the next question I've got is, I've been pretty satisfied, I guess, with the curriculum kind of across the board. I think the main concern I have with all of my kids that seems to be newish for this year is in math. Just having kids in each of the levels, elementary, middle school, and high school. And this subject has been like the challenge, at least at our house in this hybrid model, knowing that they just have those 2 days of synchronous and then 3 days of asynchronous. And, one of my kids, I'll be anonymous about it, not to throw anybody under the bus, but he or she was saying that that person was consistently getting kind of like new coursework being taught in asynchronous time as opposed to reiterating the lessons that were being taught in the synchronous time. So I guess my question there is, how are we working to avoid confusion like that? New ground, trying to cover new ground, especially in math, which seems like the most difficult for a parent to step in and say, here's how you do it, because it's a completely different way than we learned it too, right? So it's difficult for us to like step in and say, here's how you do it. And then I guess more broadly, as I think about math, there was a story that I saw just on social media today that said that NWEA study results, right, from MAP scores this year. Sounds like nationally that MAP scores in math have declined nationally, just as everybody's going through this pandemic. And I'm just curious to know if we're seeing any of those same results in the summative or formative results, and if so, would we shift the schedule at all to accommodate for additional math time? It just seems like math, at least in my house, and now what I'm reading in the newspaper to like justify how I'm feeling, I guess, it feels like a concern. So thank you.
Well, I think, Sean, I'm right there. What's really important to note is that I have two little boys here in Wauwatosa. Nicole has two boys here in Wauwatosa. We're parents here, and we feel this struggle too. So as we speak to all the things that, we're trying to do here in teaching and learning, we also wear the hat as parents here in Wauwatosa and know the challenges of trying to support learners at home. So want to not be dismissive and share that those challenges are real, right? I think something to be thinking a little bit about as I hear your comment about, struggling at home and kind of being able to weigh as a parent, like what is that, where is that productive struggle? Because at times teachers might be introducing new content, but that new content might not be something that they actually have to master in that grade level. And so as parents, what we want to do sometimes is we want to sit down and we want to almost help and support, get the answer, get it correct, work towards it, master it, right? And in reality, a teacher might be planning for some of that new learning, some of that new instruction as an introduction, as a way in which to provide some of that productive struggle so that students can bring back some of their misconceptions or their challenges as they come back into those synchronous days. So I can't speak specifically to if that's the case, but I think just as we talk about what we see at home and levels of frustration, we don't want kids to reach a plate of frustration, but some of that productive struggle is really great for our kids, and to be able to bring some of that back and be able to talk about it when they're live with their learners. I think that's just something as you were speaking, I wanted to note a little bit. And then I don't know about NWEA, if anybody else wants to kind of highlight on that.
I can speak to it a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Missy.
Yeah, I think I saw the same report NPR reported on that report that was published by NWEA, and a couple things that they included in that report was one caveat that it is a very limited representative sample of students, and so not all students have been represented in the testing that did occur. And then secondly, testing environments are not typical right now. So what we did gain from the testing that was provided and administered earlier in the fall gives us some sense that there isn't a major slide that has occurred based on who was tested, when they were tested, and how they were tested. But they did report that things are not as bad off as some of us may have anticipated nationally with looking at math and reading, the slide that's talked about in the national narrative around that.
Are you done, Sean? Did you have anything else?
Yeah, I think my only question was just in math, or I guess just generally across the board for other subjects, knowing that we are keeping an eye on formative and summative results, like are there any gap areas where we're really just looking at individuals and not?
Dawn, your microphone appears to have dropped out.
Mine has?
No, you're good now.
Okay. My question was, are there any
Is Mr. Rowland fading in and out for everyone?
Well,
Sean, your finger might be over the microphone.
My question is, can you still hear me? So my question is, if not math, or if there's any subjects that we have seen a formative or summative slide in any way, and if that was the case, would we shift at all?
So I know that all of our schools are collecting that data. We talked about our MLSS teams and how they are looking at individual student progress across the board. So at this point, I wouldn't say we have been notified that there are any specific large gaps. However, though that readdressing of student learning and teachers reteaching or pulling small groups, like that's happening across the board. I think if we saw something glaring, absolutely, we would be pulling together very quickly to determine if there was something bigger from a systemic level we needed to be doing it to be able to support learning.
Okay, no, that's great. I mean, if we're not seeing that across the board and we're just seeing it a little bit here in individuals, then that's good news.
I have a question kind of to build on what Mr. Rowland was talking about. So kind of in that testing or way assessment that we have, what are we doing, or how are we sort of engaging what this is doing to our achievement gap and what that looks like? One of my greatest concerns about continuing this model is there a greater negative impact to our economically disadvantaged students, our Black and Brown students? You know, what does that look like? And I don't want to make assumptions in that area. I'd like to know if we have a way to measure that. Maybe the answer is no. I understand that it's not perfect science, but what can we do to sort of close those gaps? I mean, is it even just attendance and participation that we can look at? You know, are kids who are going to typically be at risk this school year even more at risk now, or have we been able to successfully close that gap, or at least maintain the gap without, you know, further slide there? I'd be interested to know what we can do in that area and how we're measuring it, and you know what we can do going forward to kind of get a good grasp on that. We know that COVID has a greater impact on Black and Brown communities from a medical standpoint. I guess I'd like to understand, if we can, what that looks like in Wauwatosa in terms of a learning standpoint.
I can start to speak to that a little bit. I think part of the answer was in your question, Mr. Dolman, was that we know that there is no distance between health inequities, education inequities, economic inequities, and so forth. So the intersection of all of these inequities at play do have a disproportionate negative impact on students who have been traditionally marginalized, both inside and outside of the school system. And so while we have struggled to really find a way to really capture accurately and exactly what those gaps are and how the depth and the nature of those gaps, we do know that there is a gap that's at the very least being sustained. But however, instead of looking at gaps from an achievement framework, I would ask us to look at it from an opportunity standpoint. So what are some things that we can do to close opportunity gaps so that we can limit the impact on the achievement gaps that are, you know, for the most part, sort of manufactured because of the things that we do within our system. And so what are we doing around engagement? What are we doing around attendance? What are we doing around some proactive supports with our student services team that Mr. Porosky has been doing a really good job of leading and helping to think through some different mechanisms of outreach and support, and then identifying adults in the building that kids have connections with and leveraging those relationships to enhance the engagement and increase the activity and productivity within whatever learning environment that kids may be present in.
So I appreciate that, Mr. Rogers. Thank you. So if I'm understanding, kind of focusing on the opportunity gap, which I like that thought a lot of that would be similar to what we'd be doing in a normal environment, although maybe the opportunities are different in different places, but really that's the focus. Same focus we would take, you know, had we been in a 5-day-a-week school type setting. That's what I think I hear you saying. I just want to make sure I understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And since we are in the midst of a crisis, we know that some of these challenges and some of these inequities are much more exacerbated and exposed. But the nature of how we've approached it in getting families options and working to really build robust supports within each of those options, and then listening to families' needs and learning from that, and then recalibrating our systems to respond to those. I've seen a lot of good work happen around some of those things.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, I just want to add that just from a total organization, when I look at that challenge, to me, it's the biggest challenge we have and the biggest concern for me that we have in our district right now going through the pandemic is what it's going to do to those gaps for 38% of our students that are students of color, for 30% of our students that are students of poverty, for anybody that is struggling through this. You know, the discussion and the umbrella that we have as a district of equity and making sure that stays our focus, because it's pretty easy when you're going through really tough times like this and people want to just kind of bring it back to themselves and their own kids. And, you know, I want to make sure my kid gets the best of everything they need, where prior to this, our focus was in a good place of what we're trying to accomplish for the students that were having a tough time. I just think as an organization and as a school district, we got to make sure, and the board needs to hold us accountable to make sure that we keep that as our priority and continue to do it. So I guess I'm asking the board to make sure that you hold our feet to the fire on it. But I mean, I just look at it anecdotally in our district, across the country, across the state. It's a major concern. And whether or not there's data to show exactly that we're being successful or we're not, I think it stands out as something that we got to really make sure we keep our focus on.
I was just going to follow up. I appreciate Dr. Ertl and Nassif's earlier comments just about the equity issue. I would say from a student services lens, I wouldn't necessarily have like anecdotal data, but I would say 98% of my phone calls from, parents, guardians, sometimes even students, is about either unmet needs, the reality or the impact that COVID has had on their family, the fear that they have, and oftentimes asking for empathy or kind of a ability to, I still want to learn. I really do care about school, but right now there's a lot of other things going on. So like, please help me make a consideration of like a change to a mode of instruction, or this is something that we're lacking right now. And I've been really impressed with kind of how we've tried to put our hands around that, take the time and personalize those situations, so that our students and our families know that we care about them. We want to help people to the best of our abilities. But that's really a point where I don't think the board has probably heard as directly from that maybe unheard population of our community. Because oftentimes they're not going to reach out or make that public that there's a need for additional help. But it is a very real concern. And I know something that we continue to look at as far as teaching and learning and how we continue to better meet the needs of all of our kids.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Peralski. I think you hit on a really important point that oftentimes our most vulnerable population is not necessarily our most vocal population. So obviously myself and all the board members and everyone has been inundated with communications and emails and things like that. But I do try to keep in mind, I'm not sure we're hearing from, some of what I think are our greatest stakeholders and what those families are. So trying to do whatever I can to kind of gauge what that is like. So that's a great point.
I guess I can speak a little bit from what I've been experiencing on the student side of things. So for the most part, I think my experience with hybrid learning has been pretty positive. I think that it kind of, for me, like my specific learning type, like I like having the instruction time and getting to work on things by myself. But I did notice last week and the week before when we were virtual, I was really struggling kind of retaining some of the information. And I think it's just so important that this is just such like a subjective, like there's so many different types of learners, and we're all trying to figure out what our best learning style is, and going virtual or asynchronous work might not be that for everybody in the same way that it is for me. So I think as a whole, my teachers have done a really good job of trying to be flexible and offering extra help when we need it. But yeah, it's definitely been kind of an awkward adjustment period of trying to figure out what works best for me and how do I manage my time, which are, of course, such important skills that we need to learn. But it's kind of interesting being thrown into them in such unprecedented circumstances.
Thank you, Nora. I want to pause and take a minute because I don't want to forget this. The 4 student school board members, Nora among them, I think Aiden might be here, and Mira, and I'm not sure who else is kind of with us tonight. Elizabeth, all have been working on kind of a pure student-focused support system for other learners. And so I just wanted to really kind of give a kudos to them for identifying a need, working with the district staff, kind of the level of kind of awe I have of you all kind of in the midst of trying to navigate all this yourselves, looking for a way to give back and to support other learners. It's just, thank you for being who you are and for putting yourselves forward for that. It is a testament to your commitment to the community. Steve, did you get all your questions answered before we?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Please move on. Absolutely.
Other student board members have kind of comments or questions that you wanted to jump in with after Nora, and then we'll keep moving.
Sure, I can jump in. So I think I'm very similar to Nora's response, but something that I wanted to touch on is that teachers have been really good with Canvas recently, and they have focused a lot on student needs, and especially my math class, kind of touching on Mr. Rollins' comment. It's very challenging, but my teacher has recorded lessons and then she'll post them so you can rewatch lessons, which is really nice. And I think that will be a tool that we can use in the future too, once COVID is hopefully better. And maybe if we go back to full 5-day school, that we can have recorded lessons, and students that miss days of school can rewatch those lessons and even study for the test and things like that I have found really helpful with Canvas and asynchronous learning. But overall, my teachers have really provided us with a lot of resources and guidance, and if I email them with any questions, they're very quick to respond, and it's very helpful. So that's just kind of my comment on how asynchronous learning has been.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Other board members who have not kind of dug into questions yet? Any comments folks want to make or have questions?
Good evening. I have a couple, if it's all right. And I did want to acknowledge the student school board members and thank you staff for putting this information together. Would I be able to get a more current copy of the presentation? I think maybe I have an old version. And would you mind putting back up the slide with the summary? I also want to acknowledge we have 50 or so citizens on the line, and I think maybe they haven't had the opportunity to see some of the documentation we were talking about. For example, vision of the graduate, the priority resources with the DPI standards. I think those are things that some of the citizens would be very interested in. And I didn't see the information attached in board docs, but maybe It just wasn't on my copy. So I just want to make sure we're sharing the same information. And I want to go back to the 3 questions that we want to make sure we have answered tonight. My reason for wanting this on the agenda is because I'm hearing such a wide range of experiences, and it's coming from all over the district. It's coming from teachers, it's coming from different levels, it's coming from parents of all different levels, all different places with their children. And what's difficult about it is our responsibility as a board, as Dr. Ertl pointed out. We need to challenge the administration and make sure that we're delivering the best we can deliver, and we know how we're delivering that.
I'm sorry, Ms. Muirfield, did you want me to bring up the slideshow now?
Yeah, could you?
Yeah, you'll have to tell me which slide you want.
It's one of the beginning slides. See, I have an older version.
Jamie, it should be slide 2. I think that's where we have those essential questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It just helps frame our conversation and make sure we're covering all the material that we wanted to tonight. So how I'm trying to process through the information, but again, I'm sensitive to the fact that we have some citizens on the line who haven't actually seen the attachments and the links. So we might be able to do that later, for their purpose, but I already have looked at those. It sounds to me what we've done, just for framing up things, is we've taken those math and ELA components, and that's what we're focusing on in this time period. Is that a correct statement? So if there were expectations about science and social studies, for the most part, those would be add-on curriculums that really our focus has been mathematics and ELA. Is that a true statement?
The state provides, Chief LaCour in the state provides a comprehensive list of priority standards for math and ELA, but we have still supported work with social studies, science, the other writing, the other content areas. Writing would be ELA, but the other content areas where we have really dug in over the past few years to think about priority work. So teachers are still addressing those content areas at the elementary level, and then within their contents at the secondary level as well. So the DPI puts out that information for us to really prioritize those areas of math and ELA, but we are still working internally on ensuring that those subjects, so the other subjects, are being taught, and that there are weight to those standards as well.
Okay. And I think for the most part, the voices that I'm hearing understand we had to focus our efforts. I think for the most part that is understood. The second question of how will we ensure students are grade level ready? That's where we get into the content of some of those bridging lessons, correct? Between the actual content being delivered and, as you said, what we're looking for here. And that's why I would really like it, if we could actually bring up that reference on the bridge document.
Jamie, if you want to go to slide 3, I'll share the example of grade 1 to, yeah, can you click on grade 1 to grade 2?
Yeah, the addressing unfinished learning document, the synthesis guideline, I think that is a really good example, it sounds like, of the content that we're trying to drill on. Is that correct?
Yes, those are the key principles. So
which document is it that you want shared, Jessica?
I think here she's asking about the first one where it says addressing unfinished learning. Sharon, do you want to see the bridging documents first, or where it says supporting unfinished learning, that bullet right there?
Yeah, let's take that. That's the first document, right? Mm-hmm. The unfinished learning document, is that one the first one?
Yes.
Let's take that one first, just so just so we're all talking about the same kind of content. I want to make sure I completely understand. So this is the addressing unfinished learning. And for example, it shows a principle, the avoid, and what we're doing instead. And I think that this document to me frames up how the lessons are being delivered. Would that be?
That's correct, Sharon. This was provided at some of our initial PD as we headed back into the school year to help teachers frame how to support unfinished learning and how to move through the school year. So we avoided doing practices in that avoid column and really focused on how to support and address unfinished learning in the green column. So yes, that's exactly what it's highlighting.
Yep, and Sharon, to go to your question about content areas beyond ELA and math where we have those priority standards, this is really what's driving our content, our specific content areas in where they need to focus their teaching and learning efforts during this time.
Okay, yeah, and so I think that there's just a lack of clarity, I think, for a better word, and Ms. Fraley can speak about this maybe a little bit in her work and how she's been working with the team as well. But I think that there was a lack of clarity also with parents about what their children would be learning, even though we may have communicated, we may have told them, and then the experience of their learning was also changed. So those two things together created this perception, I think, wrong or right, that something was going awry. And that's the difficult situation we're in, I think. And we're always trying to balance against what we did before, what we did in 5-day. And so in comparison against 5-day, this model looks completely different, even though what we're trying to do is focus down on the most important content and skills in a different way. But it's so completely different than our normal process that it's a bit of a struggle to get there. So this is why we're having the session. So I think we can understand where we are and share with the community where we are and what we need to do to go forward and how we know that our kids are going to get to grade level, even in this environment we're in a different learning mode environment, right? Isn't that why we're all here? I hope so. Okay. All right.
Yes, Sharon, that is indeed why the school board exists, to make
okay,
sure that all
thank
students
you.
and children are learning.
Okay.
And I truly believe that we've been, I have no doubt that the district and all the team have been working and driving very hard at that. Appreciate their hard work on that.
Right. It's just hard. It's hard to get from A to C because we're really not sure where we're at in B. And that's probably as best I can describe it. And I would just want to put a frame around it so we all know where we stand and what we need to do to really deliver by the end of the school year. And if something really isn't working, how do we fix it as best we can and move it forward so all kids have a better experience. And again, I'm hearing it from all different places, and I'm hearing this from the people who have very good resources to lean on and the people who don't. So I know that, and I hear from teachers in various areas of the district, and so I'm getting so many messages that I'm really appreciative of you bringing this all forward so that we can really understand where we're at. So I guess with that, could we talk about so now we talk about the content and how the content is being delivered in this learning document. Can we go to the bridging document?
Absolutely. And this was served really as an example. So Jamie, do you want to pull
Yeah,
up?
which one do you want? There's like 5 of them there.
If you link to the next bullet, it says grades 1 and 2. So I can just pull up grades 1 and 2 as that example. Do you see that second bullet there?
Yeah.
Or if you're still on that list, you could just click on the top one. That would work.
This one?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so essentially what our math coaching team worked on this summer is we took a look at major clusters and priority work of the grade level that students would have been in of spring of 2020 in that trimester 3, and thought about major priority work, major clusters of learning that needed to occur in that grade level. And from there, we looked at where that major work in those clusters or priority work occur within the context of the school year that those students would be in. So kids coming from that would have been in grade 1 moving into grade 2. And so this document highlights the major clusters of both grade levels, and again shows teachers where that learning is embedded within the context of the current school year. And if you scroll down, Jamie, just a little bit, keep going a little bit more, it will talk about ways in which teachers can engage in bridging those documents. If you scroll just back up a little bit, it talks about different activities and additional content exposure that could happen in different resources to support teachers with that. And then down below just a little bit more, if you scroll down. Jamie, yeah, there you go. It lays out kind of what would be embedded within our investigations resource. It talks about connections between grade levels, so teachers have that right at their fingertips to talk about what really is that important work in grade 1 and how can you make those connections in grade 2 to support unfinished learning. So right within our resource, teachers have additional supports. As they're teaching a session of investigations, that resource also articulates different ways in which staff can support unfinished learning. And then there's different types of examples of questions. These could be used as forms of assessments, ways to check in on those major clusters to be able to see how are our kids doing, do those quick checks, that formative instruction to be able to say, okay, I need to pull some small groups and think about how I can reteach some of these concepts so students can be ready for that new learning. And so these bridging documents really served as a way for our teachers to have a tool in front of them that would say, here's the major work of this grade level. This could have been missed. If we assume that this could have been missed in in their previous grade level, how am I supporting learners in thinking about what they need foundationally to be ready for their current grade level? And so this served as kind of that example. And since for elementary ELA, we were starting a completely new resource adoption and implementation, we were able to kind of do that right out of the gate, be able to think about our workshop structure and how our workshop structure really allows for us to pull those small groups and support unfinished learning.
Okay. So yes, it's so helpful. But I just want to really understand. So we're using the same method, not just if we have a child that needs to be caught up, but we're also using this method as we go through the year.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, we want to make sure that we are supporting all of our learners with the possibility that deep learning and rich instruction could have been missed with what spring of 2020 provided. And so our staff are really considering it as universal, but then we don't want to stay there too long because we have a lot of learning to do for our current grade level. And so then how do we continuously provide that then for students who would have more missed learning that would need additional instruction?
Okay. So this is bridging the gap. All right.
Yep.
And I just want to add to that, to what Jessica was sharing. You know, every year we do have students come to us with a wide degree of learning. And so part of our job as educators is always to identify where the unfinished learning is, regardless of whether or not we're in a pandemic. So I just want to make sure that that is also highlighted, that that's just something that we are always doing and part of our teaching and learning practices. And in terms of math specifically as well at the secondary level, we also have documents that have been provided by not only the Department of Public Instruction and Achieve the Core, but also our curricular resource CPM that have helped us identify specific skills and standards that are best done face-to-face, best can be done best independently, or where there may need to be some additional partner work. So that has really also helped inform how we are going to get students engaged in math, since that was something that was also brought up before. But I just wanted to underscore that one point about the unfinished learning.
Yeah, that is really helpful. How do we continue the learning? That is one of the other questions I'm receiving. The continuing the learning, and we talked about we're in synchronous, we're in asynchronous, and we want that to flow. I'm hearing a lot from especially the lower grade elementary school parents who are really struggling with the attention span of these young people. So they are not knowing what to do with this unfinished learning, or maybe these are children that have already surpassed what they should have been learning, and now they need more learning. And they're not teachers. So what are we doing on a daily basis for that situation, that continuum, asynchronous, synchronous, and how are we using the same logic in the modes that we just discussed?
Yeah, Sharon, I would say we're using the same logic. And I think, Nora, what she brought up is such a great point in terms of how wide of a range every family is experiencing something different. And so internally, when we think about what our classroom teachers do as professionals, they think about what it is their kids need and how then to best provide for those needs, whether kids are in person, live synchronous, via virtual learning, or they are learning asynchronously. So being able to just really adapt and differentiate and support learning for the vast ranges of learners in our classrooms, that's what they do. That's what they're trying to do. That's their goal. And it is hard, right? Teaching, it's hard in the classroom too. It's hard for families at home. So I think your question is really an important one, and Nora brought up such a great point of how wide of a range, and experiences families are having. But I think the same logic does apply. We apply the same logic. We look to have those 5 days be 5 days of learning, and think about what it is we're providing on those synchronous days, and then how we can carry that out on those asynchronous days as we would in the classroom. Not every time a learner is in the classroom are they sitting and listening to a classroom teacher lead a lesson. They're practicing something, they're collaborating with a small group, they're writing about their reading, they're reading independently. Those are all things that are happening, and engagement and supporting learners is what we try to do in the classroom, and then also support that interdependence when kids are off learning at home. As best as possible. So what are those silent teachers that teachers are providing to their classrooms, those tools and those different ways to support our students? I hope I'm getting at your question.
Yeah, you are. And so again, I'm just trying to really understand and dissect this a little bit to help frame it. And then the third question is, how do we know that our students are learning at grade level, that they are caught up with the bridge and they're learning at grade level? They will be at grade level at the end of this year, no matter what mode they're in. But we know that we want to get them to mode in person 5 days, because 75% of our families are in this mode to get there. But it isn't really the mode. We might have to make changes to the mode of instruction. That's what I'm trying to figure out. So, and this is where the assessments to me make a difference. And that assessment slide you had, that shows us how students are doing. But I'm not getting a real strong understanding tonight from the different levels that we really do have the data, or that we do have the data on every level? I know we're working on that on Wednesdays with the professional learning teams.
So Sharon, let me see if I'm understanding your question with a response here. So the content that and the lessons that our students are engaging in during this time is grade level. They have access to all of the grade level standards, the grade level content that they would if, for example, if they're in a biology course, they are engaging in that grade level expectation. Where we see the unfinished learning is that's kind of tucked in at different points in addition to what the grade level learning is taking place right now, if that helps you understand a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It does. So how do we know at this juncture, which is half the year now, how do we know we're going to get there with everybody? And I appreciate seeing the different assessments. Have they already been given, or are there still some that we take at a certain juncture later in the year, or do you have the timeline for those?
Yep. So our summative assessments, our end of unit assessments, those happen at the end of, for example, a chapter in which students are learning about, let me think of a quick one. They're learning about the Civil War, for example. And so at the end of the chapter on the Civil War, they're going to have an assessment on what they learned, and that is happening. And our teachers are looking at that data, making adjustments, and if they have to go back and reteach anything, and along the way they're constantly doing that formative assessment. And for example, I know that we've had a couple of different content areas or grade levels even push off that summative assessment or that end of unit assessment because their formative information was telling them our students aren't quite ready yet. So we're going to go back and relook at a couple of things, and then we're going to then give that assessment when we know that they are going to be successful on that test. So those sorts of things are happening right now. They always happen in our teaching and learning practices. And then in terms of some of those national and state exams, those have not taken place yet. And so we will have that information once that takes place. And then we'll be able to really have a more holistic look at where we are coming out of the pandemic. But in terms of how are we using the formative daily checks and the summative assessments or the end of unit assessments, that is something that's ongoing, internal, all the time.
Okay, so I guess aggregate data. At this point, do we have any, Dr. Ertl, aggregate data on the levels to figure out any kind of benchmarking for the end of the year?
What do you mean aggregate data?
Well, on the different grade levels, on the different, the different areas in math and reading. Is there anything we have that we can aggregate by, the beginning of the year, somewhat coming out of, March
I think
March even, just so we have some kind of just so we're knowing. I don't exactly know what the timelines are, but I know that obviously the staff has that information and they're using it. I just think we don't know at a board level what that looks like.
so. What kind of data from that would have been out there previously, pre-pandemic, are you asking about or looking for that would give you the information you're asking?
Well, I don't know, Dr. Ertl. I'm just trying to go with the 3 questions that we're trying to accomplish today, and that is, how do we really know by this school year, even in the course of what happened, that our students are actually, we did the right thing with our models, and they are learning what they need to advance into the next year, whatever that looks like. And hopefully, digital learning will still be part of it as I think Nora pointed that out. Thank you. But of course, eventually we're going to be back in the building in some way. In some way, we'll still have digital learning. That's a good thing. But how do we know when we've arrived?
So Sharon, to jump in here, the data that we generally would collect district-wide at grade level, the ACT, is the forward exam, all of that comes in the spring. We will have data about, I would think, pass-fail grades of whether or not students are doing enough to pass, which I think would be particularly important at the middle school, high school levels. That data will come in the next, 4, 5, 6 weeks. So one of the pieces of data nationally that we're seeing is, and this again, not TOSA, but nationally, that there's more students being reported of failing classes than is normally the case, that it's up a significant percentage. So that would probably be rudimentary, but it'd be a data point of saying in TOSA, across math courses, ELA, social studies, whatever we wanted to look at, we could look at, is the percentage of students passing or failing courses higher or lower than is normally the case. And I think that's a key one. What I'm hearing tonight is that we are doing constant formative evaluation at the classroom level, and that we're doing summative evaluation, particularly at the middle school, high school level, and that we have expectations for the same level of rigor we normally would, that we're being flexible with maybe when we're doing assessments at different grade levels to make sure students are kind of ready to perform well on these exams. Is that kind of a fair? Okay.
I think so. It's just I think that data is lagging for us.
I don't think it's lagging. I think we always, if you think of like when we get the data, it's usually embargoed, and we don't usually get it until August or September of the following year. It's always really quite late in terms of the forward exams, kind of average ACT score and all those pieces. It's not a real-time data point that the board ever gets. I think what would behoove us though is getting a sense of some of the things that we know immediately, of kind of like to analyze, what do student grades look like? Are there certain areas, and it's probably the things that the district teams, I'm going to guess that you've probably been talking about at your level of like, what do we see at the grade levels? What do we kind of see across elementary now that those report cards probably are going to hit in the next week or so? And it's in some ways unfair for like some of the board members who have kids right now. We're probably literally sitting next to our children in many cases. Kind of, I feel like I have a better understanding of what my kids are learning now than I ever have, because literally they're practicing presentations, and I'm sitting there listening to the lessons and everything else. So it's an interesting insight. I also know that a board member's child may be a unique outlier, so I wouldn't want to say my experience is the same as anybody else's. But what I would say is the data is not lagging. I think we're actually going to have data much faster, much earlier, and probably a whole lot of sliced in a lot of different ways. But our data always, usually comes out, is it September-ish? I know, because we look at, in full transparency, part of Dr. Erdel's evaluation looks like, what do some of these data points look like? And we always have to kind of wait for that data to come in, and we always want to wait earlier than when we actually get it.
Well, I think report card data would be helpful. I don't think that we're normally looking at that, but, and maybe we're just looking at the annual standardized tests, but in this is an unprecedented situation. We also face the perception. We're facing a lot of perceptions. And even though that's likely not reality, we're being compared against better districts who are in school 5 days a week, and the perception is that somehow we're falling short. But our team here is saying we're not falling short. We're meeting all of our obligations as a school board for our students to be successful and follow standards, and they are performing well. We just don't we don't have data to show that. And we have this terrible perception. And so,
Karen, if I can just jump in and hopefully address a couple of the questions that you had, and then Dr. Jessup Anger had as well. You know, last spring we did not have the those standardized tests that we mentioned this evening, like the ACT and the forward exam. Those were canceled due to the pandemic, and so we don't have those data points like we typically would in the fall to be able to look at. And then the other thing that I will address, and we are experiencing a little bit more in our failure rate at this current juncture as we look at comparison to, for example, last fall at the end of the first semester. But I want to also have that be a caveat, or a little caveat to that is whenever a teacher goes in and marks an assignment missing in the grade book, that defaults to a 0. And if that is a summative score, meaning that it constitutes 90% of a student's grade, that can have a significant impact on that. So while we are seeing an increase in current Fs, at present at the secondary level, I also, it's not a full summative score at this point in time. Like Dr. Jessup Anger said, you know, we will have that information at the end of the semester for our secondary level, and we'll have a better apples to apples, so to speak, comparison. It won't be exact, but we'll have a better comparison to years past once we get to that end of the semester.
Thank you.
I think it's also important to note too, with that data, as our teams are looking at those grades and the failure rate and any of the formative assessment data, the things that they're looking for are like the root cause. So if a child isn't doing well in a particular class or a course, they're trying to figure out what is the cause of that. Is there some sort of barrier with accessing technology? Whatever it is, we're trying to figure out how to remove those things and be able to give each child that comes through our system what they need to be successful. And so that's really been that focus around that conversation at the building level when they're looking at individual students.
And then
so that's a segue. That's a segue into my question, Kristen. I'm glad you brought that up. Do all of our students in their homes have the technology capabilities to take advantage of the program you're describing tonight? Are there things we're doing to mitigate any gaps that are equity based? And
Yep. So I know that Jamie's been working really hard with us to make sure that all of our students have Chromebooks that are working, that if hotspots are needed, that we're able to identify students that might have a need for connectivity. We're doing a sort of a communication campaign with families to make sure that they have an individual within their schools that they know that they can go to, that we are reaching out to families so that families we're not expecting families to come to us. We need to make sure that each one of our children have that and have that access to be able to be successful. So that's an ongoing thing, Mr. Meyer. And while I will say I feel good about where we are, I know that that's an ongoing concern for our schools, for our student services staff, for our principals, that we need to continue to stay connected on that.
so I'm really happy to hear about the outreach. I no doubt there's people in need who are too proud to ask, or perhaps unaware for whatever reason of availability. So I think that outreach that you're doing is very important to let people in need know what help is available. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, if, Mr. Peralski, I don't know if you want to say anything more specifically. I know the student services team has been really digging into that.
You know, Mr. Meyer, one of the things I was really proud of is earlier this year we had one of our local businesses make a donation, and they said, we don't know what you're going to need it for, but we know you're going to need it for something. And Dr. Ertl and Mrs. Bowers were nice enough to say, student services figure out how we want to use this donation. And so we were able to really listen, as Mrs. Bowers said, like, what are the needs? And one of the biggest things now is I would say, like, the devices are kind of like my version of a pencil when we were in school. If you don't have it, you can't learn. and you can't participate. And so one of the barriers we saw quite a bit was, and I think Jamie's done a really nice job with this historically, but just having this additional resource I think helps, is sometimes our families might not take the insurance for our devices, or they might lose the cord for the Chromebook, or it might not work. And so we now are able to have like kind of an extra fund where if I am the social worker, counselor, or somebody in student services and that occurs, we don't have to have the stigma. There doesn't have to be the lag. We can simply let that administrator let Mr. Price know, and he can work with the techs to get out something as quickly as we can so that kids can stay up with their learning. So that's something I've been really proud of the team for doing. And I think it goes back to Mrs. Bauer's point earlier. A lot of it really happens because of the relationships our adults have with our families, and that our families are really appreciative of our teachers and our student services for really always advocating for what our kids need. And so I think that's been a great example of kind of like a community partnership that worked into something within the schools. And then Jamie and his team have been able to really help us with to ensure that kids are able to stay connected.
Okay, thank you.
If I could go back to Ms. Mufeld's question, I agree both that the data is not lagging. We don't have the data because that's just the way schools work right now. But I agree that ideally we would have some data to be able to show where students are performing, where the differentials are, et cetera. I know Ms. Bowers, when I had asked you about that, you had said potentially as early as the beginning of February, we'd be able to see first trimester elementary and then first semester secondary. Is that still something that we could count on?
Yep, I believe that's when we were talking about some of the common summative assessment data at the elementary level that we have, those end of unit assessments. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, because for me, I'd really like to. I'm actually less worried about the state data just because we're not going to have data from last year. So whatever dip we see, we're gonna hate it regardless. But we're not going to have anything to compare it to from last year. So it's going to be painful no matter what. What I'm more interested in is hearing about those unit summative assessments and how we're seeing differentials in semester grading. And Ms. Marble, I'm really glad you called out the secondary grading piece, because as the parent of a secondary student, sometimes, it takes your breath away when you look at a particular class and it's missing something and your kid is saying, but this is missing. I really have a B+. So I'm really hoping that we can see that data as soon as possible, because we are being asked. The only thing I would disagree with, Ms. Mufeld, is that I don't think they're better districts. I think parents are comparing our district to particularly school districts in Waukesha or Oconomowoc who are going 5 days. While I want nothing more than to see our kids back in school 5 days, I'm much more concerned about the volume of learning than where they're sitting when they get that learning. And so I just want to continue to push us to think about how do we ensure that we're supporting our teachers to be as efficient as they can, because I don't think someone teaches second grade. I think they teach first through fourth generally. And so bridging is something that has happened since the beginning of teaching. And I also think that this year, like never before, teachers are being asked to be the most efficient they have ever been in terms of covering multiple standards or high prioritization standards in one lesson, having thought ahead 3 lessons. I feel like we're playing chess nowadays versus checkers. And that is a huge mental lift on teachers, given that they're also balancing the needs of their own kids and life in general. So I want that data too, Ms. Bufeld, and so I'm glad you raised it. And the only other thing that I'm sort of left wondering about right now, specific to student needs, and it sounds like we have a good handle on those, but how, when we have the change in in instruction, how folks just signed up to change to one or the other. How are we making sure we're staying on top of the folks that are changing possibly into TOSA Connected, who are currently phased into learning, or vice versa? I don't want those changeover families to sort of get lost in the shuffle of things happening.
Mrs. Fraley, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that is something that, at least at the secondary level, we are currently in the planning process of how we orient our learners into the different modes of instruction if they are changing. Because some of our learners at the secondary level, we're going to be welcoming back into the brick and mortar building for the first time since March. And so we want to make sure that we are orienting them and are wrapping around and being supportive of their transition. And then same with our students that are coming to us back from WVA. You know, they will have a learning curve in terms of the use of Canvas and how things work in TOSA Connected, if that's the model of instruction. So we are waiting to see what our numbers are, and that window closed this evening. And so we will be moving into our planning phase of that orientation process at the secondary level in the coming days.
And I would add that that was definitely on the radar of our elementary principals team, and working with our teachers to support those transitions at the trimester. You know, relationships, our morning meetings, we use those Wednesdays in a way to gather all of our students. Our two cohorts join together on Wednesday mornings. And so how are we fostering, you know, and welcoming our students as they're transitioning to different modes of instruction? So
Mrs. Fraley, it might be simple, but I know from a student services standpoint, at the elementary level, all of the elementary schools did something as just common as like, what questions do you have? What concerns might your child have as they're coming back or making a change? Again, to kind of just really see what does that individual student or family need.
And I can just add, Mrs. Fraley, that for our students with disabilities, we had made the plan for those students to stay with their building level case manager. So there is that continuity of the same case manager for our students that are moving to and from phase into learning and TOSA Connected. And for our students with WVA, making sure that that new case manager does some outreach for that student. So they've been supporting those students through that process.
Just to be brief, I guess, just to follow up on what Mrs. Fraley and what Ms. Meefeld talked about earlier in regards to the data. I think we did make some database statements tonight related to, did we see a slide or not? Sounds like maybe the slide that we saw, if there was one, wasn't that bad. So if it's possible to see that data, it sounds like, you know, we said it, so it must exist somewhere. So if we could see that data, that would be helpful. Again, for us to be able to tell the story to others who are asking us, how's it going? Then the other question, or the other topic that was brought up, was that we didn't see, you know, a big slide across a particular subject, whether it be math or whatever. If we can see that data, I know it's atypical and out of pattern for the school board to be requesting data like that, but this is like an atypical year with a lot of like atypical questions happening. So if we could get those data points that we talked about tonight just sent to us in an email, or I think all parents honestly would benefit from the affirmation that we're not seeing, you know, their worst fears realized in the numbers that we're seeing. I think that'd be helpful to everybody.
Yeah, and so just to make a couple clarifications, which is why we're having this discussion, and this is exactly what is being experienced in the community, what we were just discussing. What is a lagging indicator? A lagging indicator to me is not as you have described it. A lagging indicator to me is not data we don't have or can compare against. A lagging indicator to me is something that we can't do really anything with it in a given year once we've received it. There's no impact we can make on it. It's just a figure and a data point in time. So a second clarification would be, we are a leading district in Wauwatosa, and we can't be compared to other districts, and other districts cannot be compared to us. what I want to make sure is, because we are a leading district, that we're doing everything within our power to chart the course where we can get, we can take what we've learned and move it forward in a better way, because our district is one of the only districts that is trying and being successful at delivering education in all these different modes. But what we're missing is some of our conversation here in quantifying that. So that's why I want to kind of peel it back and really figure out what is it we're doing. And that was the purpose of my line of asking questions and clarification. So you can see how different listening in different forums and the meaning of different terms is confusing just for us. Imagine what it's like out in the community, especially when they have a lot of pressure and they're seeing all kinds of different things where school districts are being pit against one another in the situation, and it's just a perception. It's not a belief, it's just a perception, but we have to knock it down and let our community know what great things we're doing. And if there are things we have to improve on, we're going to take what we learned and we're going to improve them for the kids and our families. So that was my clarification.
Mr. Phillips, I wanted to check in with you to see if there was anything that was on your mind tonight.
Oh, I want to thank everybody for taking time away from their families to do this deep dive with us. Very informative. I learned a lot, and especially from the questions that have been asked. So again, thank you guys. I know there's a lot of personal responsibilities that you have outside of your day job, and all 18 of you taking the time away from your families to do this is very much appreciated. Thank you.
A couple of questions I had, and a lot of which have been spoken to already. One is kind of what we're seeing, kind of going to review, part of this will be a review. One is kind of what are we seeing in the formative? And I would love to hear kind of like as teachers come together and talk about what they're seeing in formative and trends across grade levels and across areas of learning, what they're seeing in kind of formative assessments and what are we learning. I'm going to guess these are things that you're talking about in your professional development times. Where you're coming together and saying, here's some things that we're seeing, here's where things that are working, things that are not. Kind of would love to kind of hear what we're learning through that and how that's being shared and utilized. And then similar to what Leanne and Sharon have stated, kind of what are we learning through any summative assessments? What are some consistent things that we're seeing in terms of areas where there's a lot of successes, areas where there's challenges? I would love to hear, I keep talking to my kids, particularly my middle schooler, about the things that she's learning right now and how it will be beneficial to her in terms of executive function, in terms of capacity to kind of set her own schedule, in terms of navigating, setting up her study times, how to get questions answered when she needs to. And so I would love for us to find a way to kind of evaluate and assess what other learning is happening right now and how we find ways to amplify that when we're back into 5 days a week. So that Dr. Ertl and I have talked on a lot of different times about we are, without necessarily by choice, innovating and trying a lot of new creative things. Nora, maybe it was Nora, it could have been somebody else too, was talking about recording math lessons and how those can be utilized. So all of that innovation that's happening right now, for me, the key to innovation is always how do you spread it so that it's not just done by one creative teacher who maybe tried something, got lucky, and it worked, and they kept doing it and expanding it. But how is that innovation shared across the district to amplify learning? And so what things are we learning? The conversation about bridging is really good. And I think you said teachers are teaching not grade 2, but grades 1 through 4. And that was a good light bulb moment for me again. I'm thinking a lot about for teachers next year, of how do teachers know what students have and what they don't have. This year's teachers are taking students kind of along throughout the full year. Next year, they're going to be landing in new classrooms with new teachers. And how do we help make sure teachers know where the students are at so that we're kind of getting them to the place where they need to be successful. That brings me to this kind of my other piece that I keep thinking a lot about summer school. TOSA has historically had a pretty robust summer school program, and I'm wondering what can we do to be thinking now. I keep dreaming. Sean had something out on his social media page about dreaming that we're getting near the end of the pandemic. I was feeling hopeful when I read that. I don't know if we are, but I would love to imagine that summer looks a lot more normal than this moment in time. And so if it is, how do we kind of harness that sense of normality to do as much as we can over the summertime, and particularly to nudge and coach students who would particularly benefit from summer school to engage in that? And how do we think about what our summer school offerings are, particularly at the elementary and middle school level, to put whatever any additional supports that need to be in place for them to be successful going into next year. I've also talked to Dr. Ertl about, is this the time that we go to year-round school? I'm not going to push for that right now. Folks are busy. But I'm wondering how we think about kind of our summers as a time to really amplify and build upon the learning that's been happening. Last thing I would say is this is, I think, really good. I hope one of the things that we can take away is, particularly as a parent in the district, of helping for me to understand and for all the other parents of how does this all work together? And maybe I know this was intended specifically for the board. And we have a lot of community members who are watching tonight. But for us to think about as we go into the winter break, what have we learned about student learning in the pandemic? Something crafted for elementary students, for middle school students, for high school students. How does this all fit together? And kind of a short, I don't know if it's a presentation or a voiceover PowerPoint or just some written documentation of here's how this all fits together, and here's the kind of the role of the student in learning, the parent and family in learning, and the teachers, and so how the synchronous and the asynchronous all work together. I think in addition to speaking to where we are seeing students learning, and so if there's kind of fears and anxieties about falling behind and what that means, what are we actually seeing as opposed to what are we scared of possibly seeing, and then what are we doing, and what is everyone's role in the kind of the amplifying the learning as we go, so it all works together as effectively as possible. I think could be a really great thing that we push out to the community. Any more student questions and comments from student school board members? I don't see any final kind of school board questions and comments? Or
Dr. Jessica Banger, just one comment about, I think we struggle in schooling overall when you think big picture of how to demonstrate whether or not kids are learning and whether or not we're effective as a school district. It's the age-old argument. It's become more magnified right now. I think, Mr. Rowland, the question about the slide, but not as much as we thought. That's an NWEA study. We can get that information out. But I would also, as you all are looking through and scouring the wire, and if there's something out there that other districts are doing to demonstrate, and there's some data points that can be looked at, I'm definitely open to looking at what other districts are doing, and if they're finding ways to demonstrate whether it's working or not working. But I just would ask for patience, because I think it was mentioned several times by several people that, there's not a ton of empirical data to say, yes, kids are learning. No, they're not learning. We trust our teachers that the formative assessments they're working through, but just generally overall, we'll keep working to get that data more so than we've had in years past. I think there's going to be some good information that will be coming. And I know people are looking for it right now and want some assurances that what we're doing is working. And I feel confident that our kids are going to be in a good place. They're in a good place and will continue to be successful. So.
I just have a question on what are the next steps, Dr. Dissabanger? I mean, we've heard a lot of good information. I know we're talking about some follow-ups. We have a standard meeting next week, correct? Monday? Is there anything going to come forward? Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Yep. Can you talk to me in terms of what specifically?
Well, I don't know. Will we make any will there be any adjustments? Is there anything that might come forward next Monday as a result of our in-service tonight? Or was just information and some follow-ups will come out of it?
I think if there's anything specifically that any individual board members would like to see come out of this, a couple of things I heard tonight was a desire for some specific data that we have currently. That there's a commitment in February that we'll have more kind of a mid-year more of a robust data that it sounds like Leanne and Ms. Bowers and others have been talking about. I think I would like to see a communication that kind of goes out to parents and families of here's how, and I think this has gone out, but I think this might be a good time to send it of here's what learning has looked like. Here's kind of the roles and responsibilities, and here's how it fits together. And I think that was done really nicely tonight. I often hear a lot about my child is only in school 2 days a week. And I think what I've experienced is that the intensity of learning of my elementary student is way more on asynchronous days than the days she's in school. Like she literally time on task is greater when she's sitting next to me, kind of focused and doing stuff on math or social studies or whatever the case may be. So I think explaining that how the asynchronous and the synchronous marry and interact with each other would be a good thing. And that'd be important. Are there other things that you or others would like to see come out of tonight?
Well, I don't know if the administration would recommend any other help that the board could provide. I don't know, or we're just going to stick with what we're doing now. I guess you'll think about it and let us know.
Yeah, if there's something that we need for help, we would ask.
Okay. Well, I know we talked about waivers too in the past, but it doesn't sound like that's something we're going to need to do now, or?
It's been recommended that we wait toward the end of the year to request waivers to make sure we actually need them.
Okay, that's what I was thinking, but I didn't want to lose that point in case we needed to do something, you know.
Dr. Earl and I usually will meet early on Wednesday morning to put together our agenda for the upcoming meeting. If there's other kind of items folks specifically would like coming out of this for you to folks to think, you've got about probably 36 hours or so to kind of shoot us anything that you might want to see on the agenda. And we've got the kind of the medical advisory panel is keeping an eye on the data. Of what we see and what we talk about in terms of whether or not to bring students back 5 days a week at the elementary level. So that's something that we'll be talking about, if not at our next board meetings, certainly at the one immediately following that. So that decision, I think, is just down the road, and they're taking a look and reviewing the data on a daily basis to see if it's trending in a place where they would make a recommendation for students to come back 5 days a week. So at our last board meeting, that was really kind of an intensive hour-long presentation that we had as to kind of their recommendations and where things were at and what metrics they wanted to see before they made that recommendation to go forward. But I know we're kind of floating right around the data levels that they wanted to see before they made that recommendation. So I think that possibly will come up at our meeting on Monday. We'll see where things are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This was very helpful. I really enjoyed the discussion.
One of the things that I continue to be impressed by is how we are continuing to learn and adapt and find ways to I'm hearing like the board is really interested kind of broadly of what's happening and as we should be. I'm hearing a ton of conversation though, and I heard it from lots and lots of people, and I hear it from lots of teachers about the incredible level of care and concern that they have for the individual student. And so how do we not let any kid get stuck, kind of get stuck falling through the cracks? How do we make sure that we're creating the safety net? And I've been incredibly appreciative of the creative ways that folks have kind of gone above and beyond to do that. So thank you all. Mr. Phillips noted that early on that you are all working incredibly hard. The teachers in the classrooms are working incredibly hard. That this is both not ideal and harder than ever. So Thank you all for everything that you're doing for our kids. We greatly appreciate you, and we know it's not easy. We know we're expecting and asking a lot of everyone in the district. Dr. Ertl or Ms. Bowers, any kind of closure you want to put on our conversation tonight?
Thank you to everybody for your time and questions and comments, and keep them coming. And we'll do everything we can to make sure you feel informed and know exactly what's going on.
Okay. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Rowland. I can call the roll. Mr. Doman?
Yes.
Ms. Fraley?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes.
Ms. Mufeld?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yep.
Mr. Rowland?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Jessup Angers, a yes. And our meeting is adjourned at 8:56 p.m. Thank you all.